Hey guys, welcome back to English with Dry. Today we are taking a look at English Language Paper 2, Question 4. As you should know, this is from the paper called Writers' Viewpoints and Perspectives. For this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. We are going to take a look at the example again of the Glastonbury Festival versus Greenwich Fair paper on the AQA website. You should remember, of course, that this is a comparison of views and perspectives rather than anything else. It is worth 16 marks, and let's have a little look in more detail at the question. So the first thing to note is that you should be thinking about the whole of source A together with the whole of source B, which means you need to actually take in the entire message and point of view of each author. If you only refer to small sections of this, you will not be able to capture what they are actually getting across. For instance, it could be that they begin with quite a sarcastic tone, and that is something that changes over the course of it. However, if you only analyse the beginning, then it may be that you get an incorrect impression of what they actually mean. Similarly, if you only look at the end, it might be misleadingly negative or positive, and it might actually not summarize entirely what they're trying to say. Writers are an odd bunch, particularly they like to mess with you as they go through and change your perceptions. Now, the next part is something that AQA always like to do, which is they teasingly suggest in your answer you could. Now, what they mean is that you definitely have to do all of those things. Could is not the accurate word there. Actually, more accurate would be to say must. You must do all of these things. Now, you shouldn't do them in a 3 bullet point list like they've said here, but you absolutely need to tick all of these points. You must compare the different views and experiences, the methods they have used to get those across, and also quote from the text, or use references, as by now should be clear. Now, methods means any language or structure device that the writer has used to help the reader understand their point of view. This could be absolutely anything. As I hopefully think that you all should know by now, it doesn't actually matter whether you know the name of these techniques. More often than not, if you can explain what the writer is doing, then that is far more important than being able to talk about an ascendentic list or a semantic field. These things sound great, but in reality actually equate to no marks. If we look at this question, it is assessment objective 3. Now, in language, the assessment objectives are different to in literature. So in language, this one is compare the writer's ideas and perspectives, as well as show how these are conveyed across 2 or more texts. Now, I've broken this down a little bit for you, just to make it slightly more clear what they mean. Compare means finding similarities or differences between 2 or more things. The most common question in the whole world is, can we talk about the similarities as well as the differences? Now, when the word compare is used, what the writer is saying is you can do either. It's not important. A comparison will automatically show similarities and differences, not just one of them. The next is perspectives. A perspective is the way someone looks at or thinks about something. A perspective is usually governed by somebody's background, by somebody's surroundings, by perhaps their culture, their ethnicity, a million different things. However, in this question, you are not expected to know everything about the writer's backstories. It just so happens that in this exam paper, one of them is written by Dickens, who many of you will studied, but 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have a clue who it is. So you don't need to be talking about the context of their ideas. You don't need to say things like, oh, in Victorian times, this was common, because that's not what is being assessed. What is being assessed is your ability to read someone's work and understand what their point of view is. Finally, the word conveyed. This is a good word to use in your English literature essays because conveyed simply means to transfer or deliver something, i.e. the writer's methods. How is the writer getting across their idea using methods? What method of delivery are they using? Are they using the postal service? Are they using UPS? You get the idea of my analogy. How are they getting it across to you, what they think? Okay, without any further ado, let's take a look at the sources themselves. Now, in the last paper, I read out source A at length. I'm not going to bother doing that again. You can simply look at my previous video on paper 2, question 2. This is the one where Elizabeth Day hilariously discusses how bad she thinks Glastonbury is going to be, only to later on slightly warm to it. Are We Having Fun Yet is its title. So, if we look at that first couple of paragraphs, we can see several things that convey her perspective. She talks about tea-colored water, about people being stuck in mud, about people being shivering, and the survivors of a terrible natural disaster. She describes this weather as though it's causing death and destruction, and this is a clear exaggeration, which shows how unpleasant she personally is finding it. Yeah, exaggeration is always a technique used to make somebody think something is more or less good or bad than it actually is. Okay? Now, here she's trying to make it seem like the weather is dreadful. It's obviously bad. Is it as bad as a natural disaster? No, that could even be quite an offensive description, but essentially her point is she doesn't like it. As she progresses, she describes the initial feeling that she had when she was told she was going to go there, undiluted horror. Again, this is exaggeration. I very much doubt she felt quite that bad about going to one of the most popular music festivals in the world. What is happening is they are designed to emphasize her dislike of the surroundings, but also outline her surprise at how much everyone there is still enjoying themselves. This article isn't really about her, it's more about the festival itself. And by initially describing how horrible she expects it to be, she gives a much more interesting impression about why people like it. It actually really further reinforces how good Glastonbury is, that even despite bad weather, people love it. She then goes on to talk about what is actually happening. She talks about the bands, she talks about the attractions, and then she finally discusses a story where she quizzes a festival goer about what happened to his shoes, which he lost. Although he doesn't seem to mind, he seems almost happy. And by the end, she seems to have changed her mind, because the overwhelming positivity of the people have helped her to have a good time. So that's the kind of arc of this piece. And as you can see, as I said before, at the beginning, she talks about how much she dislikes it. By the end, she's kind of changed her mind. If you don't talk about the whole source in your answer, you will not get across this kind of subtle nuance. Source B is, of course, where Dickens talks at length about Greenwich Fair with some of those wonderful long sentences and lists that we all know and love. Dickens himself has got a lot more that you can quote in terms of talking about his opinion. He uses a long list immediately, which creates an impression of a very busy place. It shows a feeling there's so much going on he can hardly keep track, and the fact that he is almost overwhelmed. Okay? It's a student's favorite thing to do badly is talk about sentence structure. In this case, you can make the very clear point that by jamming his paragraph with hundreds of different nouns, he is showing that actually there is too much going on almost to keep track. Now, that is the very simple reality of it. I can barely keep up with all of these, and I'm supposedly an English teacher. So the point is, there is loads to see and do, and it's overwhelming him. It's making him personally feel like he doesn't even have time to pause to write anything else other than what he sees. He then describes the food when he actually gets there, the foods and smells. He's clearly taken the basic Key Stage 3 creative writing class that tells you to talk about the five senses. But the quantity of different foods and smells is hard for him to take in as well. And then we see this kind of sibilance at the end. Several specimens of a species of snail floating in a somewhat bilious-looking green liquid. The sibilance creates an impression that it's almost making him feel ill, this kind of queasy feeling that you get when, I certainly can imagine if he's looking at snails floating in green liquid, it sounds quite horrendous, especially when you're talking about pickled fish, oysters. These are not the smells that necessarily you would love to have coming towards you, particularly when you're surrounded by hundreds of people. And then finally, we hear about his point of view of the sounds that are going on. We hear screams, shouts, clanging, firing, ringing, bellowing, squeaking, hallooing, and roar, all in the space of about 4 lines. And it seems like it's incredibly chaotic there. The number of verbs, again, mirroring the first paragraph, except this time it's verbs instead of nouns. So much to do, it's almost overwhelming him. He almost is deafened by it, okay? So this is his perspective of what is happening at this fair. So in order to prepare for the question, we're going to have a little think about what we can do as soon as we open the paper. One very effective method for answering it is to start to accurately describe the writer's perspectives across the whole source, as we've talked about. When you read through both sources for the first time, you should annotate each paragraph, or at least the bigger ones, with a single word description of the tone or perspective of that particular moment. And what that will do is it will give you a clearer understanding of how the perspectives and points of view change over the course of the texts. I'll show you what I mean. So here is the middle section of the source on Glastonbury Festival. When I was told that the Sunday Telegraph was sending me to experience Glastonbury for the first time, my initial reaction was one of undiluted horror. Still, I thought at least the weather was good. England was in the grip of a heatwave. How is the writer feeling there? What is her perspective? It seems overall to be quite pessimistic. Undiluted horror, obviously it's an exaggeration, but equally, she doesn't want to be going there. That's not what she wants to be doing. So she anticipates it being bad, therefore pessimism. But then the rains came, 6 hours of uninterrupted thunderstorm in the early hours of Friday morning. When I arrived later that day, there was a polite drizzle. By yesterday, the rain had given way to an overcast sky, the colour of exhaled cigarette smoke. The mud, however, remained, and the only way to get around the 900-acre site was, like Anton, to resign oneself to getting very dirty indeed. Here there is almost a sense of frustration, or what I have termed exasperation. She is unhappy about everything. It all seems to be going wrong. We hear about the sky being a horrible colour. We hear about being incredibly muddy. General unhappiness is what she is describing. She thought the festival would be bad. Well, it's gotten even worse because of the weather. Everything else might have been damp, but the crowd remained impressively good-humoured throughout. It's a very safe, family-friendly atmosphere, says Ed Thaw, a music student from London. This is my 6th time at Glastonbury, and I've never had any trouble. Indeed, on my train to Castlecarry, the carriages are crammed with well-spoken degree students sipping Pimm's and making polite chit-chat. Here we have the first of her elements of being surprised. She is surprised by how much people are enjoying themselves, even though the weather is bad. So this is the kind of up spike in her mood in this article. Suddenly the graph is registering positivity for the first time. And this is kind of shown in the way that she describes talking to the people and their actual opinions about it. Almost the friendliness, the politeness, the kind of sense of communal camaraderie on the train. Suddenly, oh my goodness, this is quite good, is what she's saying. So this is the way that you can kind of track the writer's perspective across the source. Now, I've picked 3 big paragraphs here. You don't have to do it for every single one. That might take you too long. But in general, by the time you get back to writing question 4, you may have forgotten a bit about the overall tone and perspectives. Doing this at the start would be a very good way of keeping your hand in with that. Okay, so let's look in more detail at some of the quotes you could pick and how you would begin to formulate your answers. The tents are being chased by a group of shivering, half-naked people who look like they're the survivors of a terrible natural disaster. Let's take this quote from source A about Glastonbury to begin with. Well, what's it saying? The writer uses exaggeration, well, we've discussed this, to create a sense that she is surprised at how much people seem to be enjoying Glastonbury. She uses a simile to compare the crowds to survivors of a natural disaster. This conjures an image that the weather is similar to that of a hurricane or tornado and makes the reader imagine scenes of death and destruction. Then, this use of hyperbole creates a sense of wry humour, as clearly the situation is not that bad. This conveys a sense that the writer cannot understand why people love Glastonbury so much that they are willing to put up with conditions like these. Now let's look at how we might compare that with source B. We'll pick the section where he says, add to this the screams of women, the shouts of boys, the clanging of gongs, the firing of pistols, the ringing of bells, the bellowings of speaking trumpets, the squeaking of penny dittos, the hallooing of showmen, and an occasional roar from the wild beast shows, and you are in the very centre and heart of the fair. So, a number of different verbs Dickens uses to describe the sound that could be heard shows how chaotic the fair was. The text is nothing more than a list, which implies the writer had no time to take in anything other than the discordant noises he heard coming from every direction. The range of verbs he uses conveys how dissimilar these all are to each other. This creates the impression that Dickens feels almost overwhelmed by what is going around him. In each of these 2 examples, what I've done is the process of isolating the language device I want to talk about, exploring the method that the writer is using to convey their message, but then finally linking this to what their opinion, perspective, point of view, whatever you want to call it, feelings, attitudes towards the thing they're talking about is. Let's break it down even further, how to structure your answer. Again, much like with question 2, I've color-coded it and given you sentence starters for each one. So the 2 texts convey different attitudes towards ... So it's a comparison answer, so I'm going to show you how you would compare both sides. So in source A, the writer feels, thinks, or believes. You can have any synonym for anything you want like that. Then we see this through their use of technique when they say quotation. There we're killing two birds with one stone. We're identifying our language devices, using our technical language as the exam board want, and then also referring to the text. The use of the technique creates the impression that this is our beginning analysis. This is something we talked about in our last video, how to make sure that you are actually answering the question in enough depth, almost prompting yourself to talk about it twice, to talk about the language or the method on 2 occasions, so that you explore a second level of detail. The keyword is effective because it connotes. Now, you don't always have to choose specific individual words. I just personally think it's the best way to explore in more depth what is happening and to explore in more detail what writers are trying to get across. This shows the writer's feelings, thoughts, ideas of ... So this is the important one in a lot of ways because it links it back to the question. It links it back to what the writer is saying and that thing that you're actually doing to answer the question, their opinion. I know I'm saying the word opinion and perspective a lot, but as ever with AQA English language, what they want is for you to answer the question, and you can do that very repetitively. So then we would turn our attention to the second source. You should always look at one source, then the other, like this. It's a much more effective way than simply writing all about one and then all about the other, because it makes the comparison more obvious. Whereas the writer of source B feels, thinks, believes. We see this through their use of. The use of technique creates impression that. The key word is effective because it connotes. Therefore, this shows the writer's contrasting feelings, thoughts, ideas of. Okay? So, it's the same thing both times. However, it is encouraging you to be comparative. Now, this question is out of 16. I would suggest you try to do 3 of these to guarantee yourself the 16 marks. 2 would easily be enough if you do it well to get the 16. I'm purely recommending 3, time dependent. As always, it's far more important to stick with your timings and actually answer the whole paper than to worry about doing an arbitrary amount of paragraphs. But, in general, if you do 3 and you do it properly, you will get 16. Finally, I'm going to show you an example of how this could look. The 2 texts convey different attitudes towards different examples of festivals or fairs. In each case, there is a chaotic element to what is going on, however, this incites different reactions in both writers. In source A, the writer gradually comes to appreciate Glastonbury Festival the longer she is there. Despite initially feeling as though it was like the site of a natural disaster, by the final line she admits it's almost nice. This feeling is conveyed through the use of juxtaposition in the quotation, "They, his shoes, got washed away with my tent," he says cheerily. This use of juxtaposition sums up the bizarre experience she's having. Despite consistently seeing people in unpleasant positions brought about by the extreme weather, they all seem to be thoroughly enjoying themselves. This is particularly shown through the keyword cheery, as it's the last thing the reader would expect someone to be after they had lost all their possessions. This shows the writer's growing sense of the communal spirit at Glastonbury and how this is helping her to overcome the negative conditions. Whereas the writer of source B displays more of a sense that they feel overwhelmed by the mayhem at Greenwich Fair. We see this through their use of listing towards the end, when they describe the many sounds that can be heard using the following verbs: shouts, clanging, firing, ringing, bellowing, squeaking, hallooing, roar. The huge variety of noises creates a total sense of confusion in the reader, as we are unable to imagine what this all sounded like. Furthermore, the writer does not pause to describe anything in more detail, suggesting he cannot focus on any one thing and can barely keep up with what is going on around him. Therefore, this shows the writer's contrasting sense of being overcome by the fair he is at, rather than beginning to relax and enjoy himself. Now, if I just color code these for you to show exactly how they fit in with my structure that I gave you, this is the pink line section at the beginning where I suggested that you kind of briefly summarize the difference between the 2 perspectives, okay? In each case, there's a chaotic element to what's going on, however, this incites different reactions in both writers. So I'm showing that there's similarities and differences. I'm not giving away anything specific there. You may even want to go into more detail in your first line. I'm just choosing to save time. However, you should give a kind of unifying comment either at the start or the end of a paragraph to show that you are actually drawing a comparison, i.e. a similarity or a difference between the 2 sources you've been told to look at. I then give a very clear point sentence. Point sentences should be short, they should be brief, and they should be to the point. Next, I give you my quote. I talk about the natural disaster, and I mention the name of a language device, a juxtaposition. And juxtaposition is a great language device to talk about because it's easy to spot, and also it's very easy to discuss what its impact is. I explore it in as much detail as I can, talking about what it suggests about the writer's attitude. I then focus in on this keyword as we talked about. I picked the word cheery. It's the last thing the reader would expect someone to be after they'd lost all their possessions. And then finally, I kind of summarize source A. It shows the writer's growing sense of the communal spirit at Glastonbury and how this is helping her to overcome the negative conditions. The most important thing about that orange line there is that I'm linking it back to their perspective. Okay, that is something you must do, because really that is the most specific thing about this question, and it's what makes it different to any other question in your language exam for English. Then, of course, we have to have a comparative in our point sentence for source B, whereas, obviously, if you're talking about something that was the same, you would pick one such as similarly or equally. And again, I give a little bit of a summary of how Dickens is feeling. I've said that the writer of source B feels overwhelmed. I then go on to give my quote and my language device. I've just picked verbs. That's all. That's an absolutely fine language device, a list of verbs. And I'll tell you one thing, if you ever get a source by Dickens, chances are there'll be a list of something. Then my analysis goes on in a bit more detail. I've not picked a keyword this time because, although I easily could have done, you could have picked any one of those individual words and talked about the connotations of it, talked about the impact it might have had on the writer, and then linked this finally to the orange section. Therefore, the writer shows contrasting sense. So here what I'm doing is I'm linking my summary of source B to my summary of source A. So I'm not just summarizing the writer of source B's perspective, I'm connecting it with the writer of source A's perspective, rather than beginning to relax and enjoy himself. The whole final line really is doing a little bit of what the pink line is doing at the start. It's summarizing my point and it's tying it all together very nicely for the examiner to see. If you do it this way, you do 2 or 3 of these, then there is no reason why you shouldn't be getting 16 out of 16 every time, assuming, of course, you've correctly understood their perspectives. I hope you found this video helpful. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for more English language-based tutorials.